A vast flat plain stretches out under a white sky. No mountains, no rivers visible from where you stand. Just heat and dust and the sound of 10,000 voices, all speaking the same language. This is Shinar, and something is about to go terribly wrong. You have to understand what the world looks like at this moment. The flood is not ancient history yet. It is living memory. There are still men alive who knew men who built the ark. The smell of judgment has not fully left the air, and yet, here on this plain, humanity has gathered, not to worship, not to mourn, not to ask what comes next. They have gathered to build, and at the end of this chapter, one man will leave everything he has ever known and walk toward a promise he cannot see. His name is Abram. We will get to him, but first, the plain. Genesis 11 is one of the shortest chapters in the book of beginnings. 9 verses about a tower, 23 verses of names most people skip. And yet packed inside those 32 verses is one of the most honest diagnoses of the human condition ever written: pride, fear, the desperate need to matter, the God who will not let us destroy ourselves, even when we are trying very hard to do exactly that. Stay with me, because this chapter is not just ancient history. This chapter is a mirror. The people of Shinar have one extraordinary advantage. They all speak the same language. Genesis 11 verse 1 says it plainly. The whole earth had one language and one set of words, not just one vocabulary. The Hebrew here suggests one set of shared meaning, one way of thinking, one cultural grammar. There was no translation required, no misunderstanding between tribes, no barrier between a man in the east and a woman in the west. They could think together, plan together, build together at a scale no generation before them had ever attempted. This is not a small thing. You know what happens when brilliant people share a language and a vision. Cities rise, technologies appear, problems get solved in decades that might have taken centuries. The potential in that plain in Shinar was staggering, and they wasted it. Genesis 11 verse 2 tells us they traveled east, and in the symbolic world of Genesis, east is never a good direction. East is where Cain went after he killed his brother. East is away from Eden. East is the direction you walk when you are moving away from God, and you do not quite realize it yet. They settle in Shinar, the same region the Bible will later call Babylon, and they say to one another, "Let us make bricks." Now that sounds ordinary. Pay attention to this. They are not building houses. They are not building farms or wells or city walls for protection. They are building a tower. The Hebrew word is migdal, the same word used elsewhere in Scripture for a military fortress, and they want its top to reach into the heavens. They want to touch the sky. But here is what most people miss. The real reason is not ambition. Read verse 4 carefully, they say. Let us build a city and a tower, lest we be scattered across the face of the earth. That word, lest, in Hebrew is pen, and pen is the word of a frightened person. This whole project, this magnificent, audacious, sky-reaching construction project, is being driven not by confidence. It is being driven by fear. To understand who is standing on that plain, you need to go back one chapter. Genesis 10 gives us the table of nations, the genealogy of Noah's descendants spreading across the earth. And buried inside that genealogy is a name that casts a long shadow over everything that happens in chapter 11. Nimrod. Genesis 10 verse 8 says he was the first mighty man on earth. Verse 9 calls him a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that phrase, before the Lord, does not mean what you might think. In Hebrew idiom, it can mean in defiance of the Lord. A man who hunted in God's face, who looked at the covenant of Noah and decided he had a better idea. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, says it plainly in his Antiquities of the Jews. Nimrod persuaded the people not to give the glory of their happiness to God, but to believe that it was their own courage that had brought them this far. He said God wanted to keep them weak. He told them that obeying God was cowardice. You have heard that speech before. You will hear it again. Nimrod's kingdom begins in Babel, in Erech, in Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. He is the architect of the world's first empire, and empires, the Bible will spend the next 1,500 years showing you, always end the same way. They rise, they reach, they fall. But on this day, in this moment, Nimrod's dream is alive and the whole human race is behind it. Here is what they are building. Archaeologists have spent 2 centuries digging up the ancient Near East, and they keep finding the same structure. The ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid, wider at the base, narrowing as it climbs, with a temple at the very top. The Babylonians called these structures the stairway between heaven and earth. Herodotus, the Greek historian, visited Babylon in the 5th century before Christ and described the great temple tower called Etemenanki, which in Sumerian means literally the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. 8 stories tall, a sanctuary at the summit, a place where the gods were believed to descend and meet with the priesthood. That is what they are building in Shinar. Not a skyscraper, a throne room, a place where humanity could summon the divine on their own terms, where God, or the gods, would have to deal with people on human ground, at human invitation, by human design. They are not trying to reach God. They are trying to control access to Him. And now watch what happens next. Because this is the moment in Genesis 11 that should stop you completely. Genesis 11 verse 5. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the children of man had built. Came down. You have to feel the weight of that. They built a tower to reach the heavens. They stacked bricks to the sky. They spent their unified genius and their collective labor on a structure designed to close the distance between earth and God. And when God finally looks at it, He has to come down to see it. It is so small from where He stands that He has to descend just to find it. This is not cruelty. This is the Bible's way of telling you something true. Every tower humanity has ever built to reach God on its own terms, every system, every empire, every ideology that promises to close the gap between the human and the divine through human effort alone. God looks at it from a height that makes it invisible. He comes down. Not because the tower is impressive, because even at its tallest, it barely registers. And then He speaks. Genesis 11 verse 6. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Read that again slowly. God is not angry that they are capable. He is not threatened by their ambition. He is not insecure about a brick tower in a Mesopotamian valley. What He says in verse 6 is one of the most remarkable statements in all of Scripture. He looks at unified humanity and says, nothing will be impossible for them. That is not a warning about their weakness. That is an acknowledgement of their power. And that is exactly the problem, because the people standing on that plane are not ready for unlimited power. They are afraid. They are prideful. They are organized around a man who has explicitly told them that God is their enemy. They have taken the greatest gift in human civilization, shared language, shared meaning, shared vision, and aimed it at the one project guaranteed to pull them further from the only source of life that actually sustains them. Giving unlimited capability to a people running from God is not a blessing. It is an accelerant. So God acts. Verse 7, Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. And the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. Pay attention to something most people walk past entirely. God says, Come, let us go down. The same plural voice that spoke in Genesis 1 when He said, Let us make man in our image. Theologians have debated this for centuries. Is it a royal plural? Is it God speaking to the angels? Is it an early echo of the Trinity? Whatever your answer, the pattern is deliberate. The same divine counsel that presided over creation now presides over this moment of fracture. What happens at Babel is not a footnote. It is a pivot point in the history of the human race with the full weight of heaven behind it. And then the word that names the place, Babel, in Hebrew, balal, to confuse, to mix, to scramble. The people came to Shinar to make a Shem, the Hebrew word for name, for renown, for a legacy that outlasts death. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their tower to mean something. Instead, the place is remembered, but for the confusion, not the construction. They came to make a name. They left without one. Here is what the scattering costs. Before Babel, a child born anywhere on earth could walk into any village and be understood. A merchant from the mountains could trade with a farmer from the coast without an interpreter. A grieving mother could be comforted by a stranger in the same words her own mother used. That world, that seamless, borderless, linguistically unified world, ends in a single afternoon on a plain in Shinar, and the wound does not heal quickly. The history of human civilization from Babel forward is, in large part, the history of people trying to bridge what was broken that day. Empires rise partly because they impose a single language, Latin across Rome, Aramaic across Persia, English across the modern world. Every translator who has ever lived is working in the shadow of Babel. Every miscommunication between nations that has ever led to war traces part of its root back to that plain. Augustine, writing in the 5th century, called Babel the wound at the center of human society. Not the only wound, but the one that shapes everything that comes after. And God let it happen. Not because he stopped caring, but because the alternative, a unified human race sprinting away from him with unlimited capability, was a slower and more complete destruction. Sometimes the mercy of God looks like interruption, and then the chapter does something that loses most readers. It stops telling the story, and it starts listing names: Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terah, 10 generations from the flood to a man named Abram. And most people who read their Bible faithfully, who sit with Genesis week after week, quietly skip this section. They skim the names. They wait for the story to resume. They treat verses 10 through 26 the way you treat the legal disclaimer at the end of a pharmaceutical advertisement. Necessary, probably, but not really meant for you. But here is the part nobody tells you. This genealogy is not filler. It is architecture. Go back to the tower. Go back to the people of Shinar, standing in the rubble of their unfinished city, suddenly unable to understand the person standing next to them. Go back to the scattering, families fracturing, clan splitting, the unified human race dissolving into 100 directions across the face of the earth. Now ask yourself, does God walk away? Because that is what the genealogy of Shem is answering. While the nations scatter, while languages multiply and borders form, and the wound of Babel opens wide, God is threading a needle. He is following one specific line, one family, one set of names running from the deck of the ark all the way to a man in the city of who does not yet know that the God of the universe has had his eye on him since before the tower fell. The genealogy is God's answer to Babel, and it was already in motion before the bricks were dry. Notice whose line this is: Shem, the second son of Noah. His name in Hebrew means, and you already know this word, Shem, name, renown, the very thing the builders of Babel were desperate to achieve. They said, let us make a Shem for ourselves. And God gives the Shem, not to the tower builders, not to Nimrod's empire, but to the quiet, faithful line of a man who simply survived the flood and trusted the covenant. You do not make your own name in Scripture. You receive it. Now watch the numbers inside this genealogy, because they are telling you something. The lifespans drop sharply after the flood. Shem lives 500 years. His son Arpachshad lives 433. By the time you reach Nahor, just 2 generations before Abram, the lifespan is 148 years. The world is aging. The long shadow of Eden is retreating further into the past. Something is changing in the fabric of human experience. And the genealogy is recording it mathematically, almost clinically, as if to say, the old world is ending, and a new kind of story is about to begin. And then you reach Terah. Terah is Abram's father. He lives in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the great cities of the ancient world, a center of trade and culture, and, not coincidentally, a center of moon worship. The ziggurat of Ur was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient Near East. Terah lives in the shadow of a tower. He raises his son in a city built on the same theology that built Babel, the theology that says you reach the divine by climbing high enough on your own. And then verse 31 tells us something extraordinary. Terah himself sets out from Ur. He takes Abram and Abram's wife Sarai and his grandson Lot, and he heads for the land of Canaan. Terah, a man raised in a moon worship city, living in the long shadow of Babel, picks up everything he owns and starts walking toward the promised land. He just never makes it. Verse 31. Terah sets out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. Verse 32. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. 2 verses. The whole arc of a man's life compressed into 2 verses. He started for Canaan. He stopped in Haran. And there, in a city halfway between the world he left and the world he was called to, Terah lived out the rest of his days and died at 205 years old. You have to sit with that for a moment. Haran is not Canaan. Haran is comfortable. Haran is familiar. It shares cultural roots with Ur, same trade routes, similar religion, close enough to home that you do not feel the full weight of what you left behind. Haran is the place you stop when the journey gets long and the destination feels uncertain, and you tell yourself you will rest here just for a season, and somehow the season never ends. You know Haran. You may be living in Haran right now. Terah had the impulse. He felt something pulling him toward Canaan, toward the land that God had marked, toward the promise that was already forming in the divine mind before Terah ever packed his household. He got up. He left Ur. He walked hundreds of miles through desert and river valley, and then he stopped, 50 miles short, close enough to see the shape of what could have been, and he settled. The saddest word in Genesis 11 is not Babel, it is settled. And here is what the text does not tell you, and what makes this moment extraordinary. Genesis 11 ends with Terah dying in Haran. Genesis 12 opens with God speaking to Abram. The call comes after the death. The promise arrives at the graveside. The story does not pause for Terah's failure. It does not apologize for it. It simply turns, the way a river turns around a rock and keeps moving toward the sea. Because God was not following Terah, he was following the line, and the line runs through Abram. This is where the open wound of Babel begins, not to close, not yet, but to show its first signs of healing. Think about what Babel did to the human race. It fractured language, it scattered families. It took the unified image-bearing community of God and splintered it into 100 fragments, each moving away from the others, each building walls of vocabulary and culture and suspicion between themselves and every other tribe on earth. And now God calls one man out of one city and says, I will make your name great. There it is. Shem, name, renown. The exact thing the builders of Babel reached for, with their bricks and their mortar and their defiant unity. The thing they tried to manufacture for themselves on a plain in Shinar, God gives it freely, unconditionally, as a gift to a man who has not built anything yet, who is standing in a city halfway between promise and paralysis, next to his father's grave, with nothing in his hands but an instruction he cannot fully understand, and a God he is only beginning to know. And in all the nations that were scattered from Babel, God tells Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Not one nation, all nations, every fragment of the human race that flew apart on that plain in Shinar, every language that formed in the confusion, every tribe that wandered to the edges of the known world. The wound of Babel runs through all of them, and the healing, God says, runs through this one man standing at a grave in Haran. Abram does not argue. He does not negotiate. He does not stop in another Haran. He goes. So what do you do with Genesis 11? You have seen the plain. You have watched that tower rise and fall. You have heard the languages fracture and the families scatter. You have walked with Terah to the edge of the promised land and watched him stop 50 miles short. You have seen Abram stand at a grave with nothing but a promise and choose to go anyway. 3 things. Take these with you. The first is this. Fear is a terrible architect. The people of Shinar were not evil in the way we usually mean the word. They were frightened. They said, "Pen, lest we be scattered," and they built an empire around their anxiety. Every structure humanity builds to protect itself from its deepest fear ends the same way. Not with security, with confusion. The tower you build to save yourself from scattering is the very thing that causes the scattering. God is not the source of your fear. He is the only solid ground beneath it. The second is this. You cannot manufacture your own Shem. You cannot build your name into permanence with your own bricks. The builders of Babel tried. Nimrod tried. Every empire that has ever carved its name into stone has watched that stone crumble. The only name that lasts is the one God gives you, and He gives it not to the loudest or the most ambitious or the most unified in their defiance. He gives it to the one who simply says yes when He calls. Your legacy is not something you construct. It is something you receive. The third, and this is the one I want you to carry longest, there is no Haran that is too far gone. Terah stopped, but the line kept moving. The river turned around the rock and found the sea anyway. You may have started for your Canaan years ago. You may have stopped somewhere comfortable, somewhere familiar, somewhere that is not quite where you were called to go. The grave in Haran is not the end of the story. It never was. God did not call Abram in spite of Terah's failure. He called him out of it, right at the graveside, right in the middle of the stopping place. The call does not wait for perfect conditions. It comes to you exactly where you are. If this chapter moved something in you, stay close. We are walking through Genesis together. Every chapter, every name, every fracture, and every healing. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because what God says to Abram in chapter 12 will change everything you thought you knew about blessing. Genesis 11 is the wound. Genesis 12 is where God picks up the needle.